Today is Saturday, January the 8th. The title of today's devotional is Elisha is God's Prophet. Now, our scripture reading today, 2 Kings chapter 6 and 2 Kings chapter 7. These are two very long passages, and so I'm going to divide them into two different video devotionals. This is the first of two. And I think you're going to love it. Many of the stories in today's devotional are some of the favorites of children's Sunday school. Now, 2 Kings chapter 6, establishing once again Elisha as the successor of Elijah, we observe some more miracles from this man of God. Though Elijah's ministry was very public, Elisha's ministry is more private. Nevertheless, the miracles are a testimony of God's power and God choosing him as the prophet of Israel. Now, 2 Kings chapter 6 verses 1 through 7, you have the story of the floating axe head. Some of the prophets, sons of the prophets, a company of prophets said to Elisha, we've outgrown the place where we are. We need to move. Let's move closer to the Jordan. So moving closer to the Jordan River, they needed to build once again housing for the prophets as they had grown in number. In the process of doing so, they were cutting down trees, and one of the men using an axe had the misfortune of the axe head falling into the Jordan River. He had borrowed the axe. Iron in that day would have been very expensive. And so he cries out to Elisha. Elisha cuts down a stick. He tosses it upon the water. And we read in that passage that the iron axe head floated to the surface and attached itself to that stick. Once again, just a small miracle, and yet how can any miracle be small, right? Then we go to verses 8 through 12, and here is Elisha's revelation of Syria's plot to conquer Israel. Now remember, Elisha is the prophet to Israel. So the king of Israel is either very much afraid or very much in debt to Elisha. Well, one of the things that Elisha does in this passage here is that as the king of Syria would plot to invade and to even abduct the king of Israel, it seemed that the king of Israel always knew what his plans were. And so he was frustrated, this king of Syria, and thinking somebody in his court is a traitor. And yet one of his own servants said, "O king, Elisha the prophet, that is in Israel, telleth the king of Israel the words that thou speakest even in thy bedchamber." And so we go to verses 13 through 23, where the king of Syria wanted to abduct Elisha. And so I'm calling this portion here, Elisha foils a Syrian attempt to kidnap him. And so the king of Syria sent a large number of soldiers on a mission to surround a city or a village named Dothan to abduct Elisha. And so with all of this great army of Syria surrounding the city that they might abduct Elisha, the servant sees all the soldiers and he cries out in verse 15, "Alas, my master, how shall we do?" or "What shall we do?" Well, calling upon the Lord, Elisha answered the fears of that servant, and he prayed that God would open the eyes of the servant. When he did, the young servant saw, behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire round about Elisha. In other words, God sent a heavenly host as a testimony of his protection. Well, it's one of the funniest stories in this whole book about Elisha praying not to destroy the Syrians, but to blind them. And so God strikes the Syrian army with blindness so that none of the Syrians could see. And he goes to this army and Elisha says to this army, to the Syrians, "Follow me, and I will bring you to the man whom ye seek." Well, who was the man they were seeking? They were seeking Elisha. And so we know that the Syrian soldiers traveled what could have been about 12 miles. Still blind, not knowing where they are. Now imagine this great army, this small army, maybe I should say, being led by this prophet, they're all blind. He leads them into the midst of the capital city of Israel named Samaria, and there he prays that God would open the eyes of the Syrians. When he did, they were in the heart of Samaria and surrounded by the army of Israel. The king of Israel, perhaps excitedly, questioned Elisha, "My father, shall I smite them? Shall I smite them?" 2 times he asked that question. But the prophet cautioned the king and suggested the Syrians were his prisoner and he should provide them bread and water, which the king did. He nourished his enemies and he sent them away. And we read in verse 23 of 2 Kings 6 that Syria came no more into the land of Israel. Well, as we come to verse 24, some years have passed. No doubt there was a different king on the throne of Syria. And we read here now this tragic time in the history of Samaria and Israel, plagued by a siege, famine, and yes, a foolish king as well. Now, years passed when Ben-Hadad, that literally means son of Hadad, the Syrian king, laid siege to Samaria, Israel's capital city. With the city cut off by the siege, the citizens of Samaria soon exhausted their food supplies and were reduced to buying and selling even an ass's head, a donkey's head, an unclean beast, and even eating the dung or waste of doves. Now, that is a fact in history that many times in desperate situations, men have been forced to eat that which is unclean and even eat that which is disgusting. Well, in the midst of the famine, the king of Israel was one day walking on the walls of the city, no doubt, and surveying the walls, the defenses of the city, and a woman called to him. Now, this woman said to the king, "Give thy son." This woman, the other woman said to another woman, this woman said that we might eat my son today and then eat her son tomorrow. And so we boiled my son and we did eat him. And I said unto her the next day, "Give thy son that we may eat him." And she had hid her son. Now, what a tragic time! The city, God's people, Israel, the Jews, reduced to cannibalism. Well, here in the desperation, the king, in a public act of sorrow, rent his clothes, and the people looked, and behold, he had sackcloth upon his flesh. And yet the words the king was speaking were not words of humility or contrition, but words of pride and defiance. You see, daring not to attack the God of Israel directly, the king of Israel threatened Elisha with beheading, saying that God do so and more also to me if the head of Elisha, the son of Shaphat, shall stand on him this day. Why? Because the king in his foolishness was blaming Elisha for all the sorrow that had come upon Israel. The king of Israel even sent a messenger to search for Elisha and found him among the elders of the city who no doubt were seeking him for counsel. Elisha, sparing no words concerning the evil character of the king, assailed his messenger, saying of the king, "See ye how this son of a murderer," speaking of Ahab, "has sent to take away mine head?" Well, the servant of the king answered Elisha's rebuke, threatening the prophet, saying, "Behold, this evil is of the Lord. What should I wait? Why should I wait for the Lord any longer?" Now, a closing thought. Rather than sincere humility and brokenness before the Lord, the king of Israel blamed the nation's afflictions on God's prophet and would have killed him. The king's messengers, bearing the evil spirit of the king, despised the Lord, and they scoffed at the suggestion that God would provide for Samaria. Now, we're going to see in our next chapter that God answers Israel's cry and will drive the Syrians out of Israel. The famine will end, but the messenger who scorned the Lord will be punished and die. Thank you for joining me today. Bye-bye.